every single person I have ever known who has dared to step outside of what has been deemed appropriate or assumed proper behavior has faced some sort of pushback. It's almost laughably obvious, right? I am known, at least according to my grandmother, as a lady minister. And I understand fully what it is to be looked at with assumptions and judgment. This morning alone, I stopped in for a cup of coffee and walked in wearing this thing around my neck that proclaimed me different. Right? Between the heels and the collar, I was not what the assumptions were supposed to be. But I also know that I'm not the only one in the room. For so many of us, the assumptions about who and what we are and the ways that we have been classified into narrow and often painful categories are the stories that tend to stick with us. Even when they are so far from the totality of our experience. Even when we have known that love and support and welcome over and over and over again, I'm fairly certain that we could go around the room and each of us tell a story of hurt, a story of shame, even as we were simply trying to live into what and who God has created us to be. This morning's gospel text reminds us that this idea of people like us, people with stories to tell, stories of unfair judgments and assumptions and incorrect statements, stories of public shaming, it's as old as time. So at least we're in good company. There is a great deal that we don't know about the story to which Jesus is invited. In fact, we know almost nothing about it, actually. Is he the guest of honor? Is he a special guest? Is it thrown in celebration of another event and he happens to be there? Has Simon the Pharisee invited him there in an attempt to make a joke or pull a fast one? Who all else is in the room? Is this a genuine act of hospitality extended by someone in a position of power? Is Simon just trying to learn? Is he being friendly? Is he doing what his mama told him? Is he trying to be supportive? We just simply don't know. But we know that it was a public enough event that this woman, this nameless, faceless woman, was either able to follow Jesus to Simon's home, or the others in the neighborhood were already gossiping about this party, and she showed up. No matter, here she comes, boldly entering Simon the Pharisee's house, and immediately attending to Jesus, as if no one else was in the room. It must have been quite a sight. Her standing behind him, gripping this precious alabaster jar, weeping. She falls to the ground and allows her tears to flow freely onto the dry, dusty, street-worn feet of this man who, it seems, she's never met. She takes her hair, her very person, and in a stunning act of intimacy, dries Jesus' feet. She gently applies the ointment and honors him with her every action, oblivious to what's going on around her. I have to admit, if I were at that party, I probably would have been taken aback too. I don't know that I would start my questions exactly where Simon does, by calling into question Jesus' prophetic ability, but I know I would react. And if I'm really honest, my reactions would probably also have had some judginess in them. But Simon doesn't question the actions of the woman. He doesn't seem fazed by the stranger in his home. He doesn't seem to be bothered by the alabaster jar, or the ointment, or the weeping, or the hair, or the kissing. Simon's questions come from a completely different place. Does he know who and what this woman is? And Jesus responds in that classically Jesus way, with a story and with forgiveness. Jesus lets Simon come to his own conclusion about what is happening in his home and what it means to show hospitality. Jesus doesn't let him off without a little bit of a scolding, but it's so much less about punishing Simon for his mistake That it is about teaching what it means to welcome, what it means to live a life of inclusion and love and acceptance. It's clear that in Jesus' welcoming of the woman, her sin is forgiven and grace is extended to her, even before a word has been said. But for the sake of the others in the room, Jesus goes on and says it out loud. Your sins are forgiven. Be at peace. Because it's clear that the others in the room are not yet done with being a little bit judgy. I find it so striking that nobody actually questions her actions. Simon questions her morals, her past behavior. The others in the room question whether or not Jesus is able to forgive sins. But nobody asks why she's doing what she's doing, or really even whether or not Jesus deserves it. Perhaps all of that is what's most telling for me about our text this morning. Because it forces me to think about how often in our own lives, as people of faith, as people out in the world, do we first jump to an assumption, even and especially when we find ourselves either engaged in a similar behavior or embarrassed that we didn't think of it first, because it was so clearly the right thing to do. A few years ago, I was serving another congregation, and we gathered for worship on Epiphany morning to celebrate the Magi bringing gifts to the Christ child. I stood in the chancel at the beginning of worship, facing the back of the sanctuary, facing the congregation, and together we sang We Three Kings. So the church was a long center aisle, and people were standing, and so I couldn't really see everything that was going on in the back, but I saw the doors in the back of the sanctuary fling open with gusto, frankly. A little more energy than one normally finds when somebody's sneaking into church late. But I didn't think much of it. Until I saw the top of this head coming down the center aisle with purpose. This was a downtown congregation, and we, like so many downtown congregations, often found ourselves struggling to balance what it means to welcome our homeless brothers and sisters while also balancing the need for safety and upkeep of the building. And it was a hard conversation regularly. The man who came out of the center aisle was carrying with him a large pack. It perhaps carried everything in the world that he owned. His clothes were dirty and torn, and clearly he had not showered recently, but with determination, he came forward. I glanced over at my colleague who was on the dais with me, hoping that she was both seeing what I was seeing, but also not wanting to bring any alarm. I struggled with my own internal dialogue about what might happen next. All the while, I kept singing, and I am ashamed to admit that more than once I thought the worst. More than once in those brief moments, I felt fear. The man came forward, and he kneeled down at the table of the Lord that had been set before us. And before I could even process what to do next or how we might respond as a community, he fell to his knees. He stayed there for a few long moments. Now those in the front pews and seated along the aisle were looking up at me, filled with questions and certainly some concern, wondering what I was going to do. He then gently placed an enormous bouquet of tropical flowers and plants, many from our own garden, at the base of the table. Came to his feet, turned, and was gone as quickly as he'd come. Never stopping to talk to any of us or explain his behavior, though clearly no explanation was necessary. I'm not sure he even cared whether there was a sanctuary full of people, many of whom never even saw him until they saw the bouquet of flowers. That morning he had been called to worship, and nothing would stand between him and doing that. He had been called to present a gift, and nothing would stand between him and doing that. I'm quite certain that many of us present, me in particular, made some judgments and some assumptions about who he was and what he was doing, and whether or not he had a place in our community. I, like I am sure Simon the Pharisee, continue carrying my experience with a great deal of humility and a little bit of shame. I assumed many things about the man who came into our presence that Sunday morning. Much was not good. I assumed, long before I assumed that he was there to worship, just as I was. Long before I assumed that he was there to present a gift to the Christ child, I assumed that he was there to make a scene, or maybe even cause harm. I stood there and I felt fear. Fear for my congregation, for my colleague who stood next to me, and for myself. Part of this fear stemmed from knowing that I live in a world where to be a woman is still to be unsafe. And to be a woman acting outside of anything that has been deemed appropriate or traditional is to be even more unsafe. And there we were, two lady ministers, acting outside the bounds. Part of it stemmed from serving a congregation that was unabashedly progressive in a culture that says the role of the church is to keep out and exclude. Part of my fear stemmed from living in a world that knows violence and brokenness every day. And all of my fear was unfounded and unfair. We are never told what the woman who anoints Jesus' sins are. But according to Simon, and even according to Jesus, there are lots of them. She knew she wasn't welcome in that space, and yet she came anyway. She knew that she didn't have a place at that table, and yet she came anyway. She knew that she was living outside of what was appropriate, or traditional, or normal, and she came anyway. The thing that brought her to Jesus' feet, that urged her to act outside her socially prescribed expectations and demands, was far greater than the public shaming she must have known she would experience there. And in return for her courage, she received love and welcome. That's not the point of the church. The role of marginalized and oppressed people in the church must not be discounted. Whether it's the woman who washed Jesus' feet and taught Simon the Pharisee a lesson in grace, or Mary, Joanna, Susanna, and the others who we are told this morning, even just in passing, provided for Jesus and the disciples. Or for the homeless man who came into my congregation on that Epiphany morning. At the end of the day, the church is the church when it welcomes us in our brokenness, our illness, our sinfulness, real or perceived. The church is the church when we welcome as Christ welcomed, when we love as Christ loved, when we forgive as Christ forgave. The church is the church when we keep telling these stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we acknowledge that this is the hard part, and keep on figuring out how to throw open the doors and stand with those who need it most. Because God's very own beloved broken people need company in their struggle. Over the last year or so, there has been a movement among social media circles in which I lurk a little that have included the hashtag #SayHerName. For those who don't skulk as often in the extraordinary learning opportunity and time suck of the internet as I do, hashtags create the ability to link what may seem like disparate stories or ideas into a single thread. They unite communities and people who may not have otherwise had connection. Say Her Name has certainly been that at its best and at its saddest. The initial goal of the movement was to say aloud the names and stories of a growing number of Black women experiencing brutality, abuse, and violence. It grew up as a response to our being familiar with the names and stories of countless young men: Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, but not knowing the stories or names of the women. It has turned into a much larger movement seeking to name the very particular kinds of violence and marginalization experienced by women of color across our country, and the even more particular kind of oppression faced by women of color who are also lesbian or bisexual or transgender. I couldn't help but hear say her name over and over again as I worked this text this morning. I couldn't help but hear say her name. Through this text, as my life has been inundated this week with the stories coming out of Stanford University, the overwhelming courage of a young woman to face her attacker, I couldn't help but hear say her name as a major political party nominated a woman to the highest office in the land. I couldn't help but hear say her name as I thought about my own stories and as I thought about people. I couldn't help but hear say her name as our city has prepared for Pride. I couldn't help but hear say her name over and over and over again as I thought about the nameless, faceless women who changed the face of the gospel. Jesus is asking us to say her name. He's asking us to say all the names of those who haven't been welcomed, to say the names of those who haven't had a place or have been pushed out or shut down or hushed up. Today he asks us to pay particular attention to the idea that what makes us faithful women and men, what makes us the church, is not that everything appears neat and orderly and pretty and clean and prepackaged, but rather that the things, the behaviors, the stories for which our culture has tried to shame us are the very things for which Jesus welcomes us. Whether we are the woman kneeling at his feet, or Simon the Pharisee, or the others who stand idly by questioning, it is these stories that cause us to have a place at this table. We need only to have the courage, the faith, to come forward and be seated.